Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 5, Episode 9. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Oh, and Steve, I'm out of practice, presented by our great friends at Market Dial. So I want to throw that one in. So it's been a bit of time since you'd been on the mic. Welcome back from your travels.
Yes, traveling the wild north of Canada.
The Great White North in the summer is a great experience. And you had the chance to talk to our third amigo, Carl Boutte in Montreal, yeah?
Yeah, it was nice. We got to have lunch with Carl, my daughters and I, and he gave us a little tour of the McGill campus, which was fun. So
Harvard
of the North. That's what I've heard. Keep dreaming, I say, but that's fine. But yeah, it was great to catch up amidst our mostly holiday focused travels.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so this is the first of actually a two-part episode with our fantastic interviews with author, screenwriter, philosopher, Steven Pressfield. Now, you introduced me to Steven, so to speak, both in the written word and in person. Talk about how you came across Steven and why he's not a, if you're trying to figure out the name, is he running the Gap or something? He's not. He's an author. Why and how did he wind up in our podcast?
Well, I'll fanboy a little bit here. Steven Pressfield is one of my favorite folks in the world. I have really, really learned a lot from his work over pretty much, I think, close to 20 years. War of Art is not a business book. It's really primarily directed towards artists, to creative types, helping them break through creative blocks or getting stuck. And over time, though, his work on this side, the nonfiction side, as you mentioned, he's primarily a screenwriter and novelist. On the nonfiction side, he's almost become like the self-help guru, trying to give folks ways to confront this concept that we'll dig into called resistance. And I have found it very, very useful in terms of the creative part of what I do, the writing and the speaking. But I also think it's incredibly relevant to anybody who's trying to innovate. And as he's gotten into his later work, he's talked more not only about the musician, the writer, the painter, but also entrepreneurs and other folks in business. So this has gotten him great success in terms of his writing. He's been on Oprah. He's developed now a podcast, a blog and videos and a whole bunch of other things as kind of a side hustle, so to speak, to what he really does, which is this great creative work as a writer of fiction. So I just think whatever you're doing, whatever creative process you're engaged in, big and small, his work is really, really inspiring and really to the point. That's the other thing I like about his style. It's just like right to the point, not a lot of fluff. And I think people will hear that in the interview.
Well, and I picked up his book, The War of Art, on both your recommendation and the fact we're going to interview him. So I wanted to know what he was all about. I read it on my vacation, and you're right about the straight to the point. It's a fantastic book. I'm terrible at writing. It takes me forever to get anything written, so it's very helpful. And the book itself, as we'll put a link, of course, into the show notes, it's like 150 pages. Like it's not this 400-page treatise on the philosophy. Like he gets to the point, which I love. So. And you'll hear that and see that in our interviews coming up over the next two episodes. All right, a couple quick things. We'll be in Vegas, so a reminder to we're going to be at Grocery Shop, and there's a promo code. And we got a busy September. You got a busy September. And we'll be both at Grocery Shop coming up. And then we're going to go be at NACS. What's NACS? Share that with the listeners.
That is the National Association of Convenience Stores. So their annual event is taking us back to Vegas the first week of October.
Speaking of travel, you just got back from visiting with the folks at Tractor Supply, and that gets us a bit of a hint that we're going to have the folks from Tractor Supply on the podcast later in the season. What were you doing in, Nashville?
Yeah, I was in Nashville. Hal Lawton, who is the CEO of Tractor Supply, invited me to be on a panel as part of their annual partners event. So this is all their vendors that come in. And he does a CEO luncheon, so the owners, principals, presidents of their top suppliers get to come to this exclusive luncheon. And I was on a panel with a woman from the Federal Reserve who is talking about kind of economic policy and how that's going to affect the economy and retail. Yeah, and this other guy, Ward Baker, who is a political consultant, talking about kind of what we might expect coming up in the U.S. from the midterms. And I was really more to talk about the consumer and retail side. And it was a really, really interesting discussion. I think Hal's idea to blend the retail consumer side with monetary policy, with politics, just created this great dialogue. So I learned a lot. Hopefully I added a fair amount. They were nice enough, the folks at Tractor Supply were nice enough to give my book to everybody who attended. So they're just, I've had some experience with Tractor Supply in the past, spoke to their senior team when Greg Sanford, the prior CEO, was there. Some folks have been listening to the podcast for a while, know that we had Rob, their CTO, on in our first season. And I think we may have alluded to this already, but Hal Lawton, the CEO, is going to be joining us on the podcast early in November. So stay tuned. But really a fantastic company, great culture, amazing performance, and looks like they got a lot of good momentum going forward, which is, as we'll, I guess, talk about in the news, is not true with every retailer at the moment.
Well, that's a good segue, professional segue you did there for us. So let's get into news. And we're not going to, it's been a couple of weeks, so we're not going to go through 2 weeks of news. But in quick summary, let's start with earnings. Macy's, Dick's, Best Buy, Gap, Lululemon today. What say you? What say you of reading the tea leaves of the earnings?
Well, yeah, very quickly, we're coming to the end of retail earnings season, so we've gotten a pretty good picture of what's going on, at least based from quarterly financial performance. And really, for the most part, I would say it was more of the same. Macy's, Dick's, Best Buy, Gap all pretty much had anywhere from tepid sales to not great sales and declining profits. And generally, they all worried about these very high inventory levels. So, this picture of increasing pressure going forward, a lot of concern about consumer demand and just the pressure on margins and profits from having to move all this inventory. A little bit better story from Nordstrom, Ulta, and Lulu. Their financial results were pretty positive. All of them, though, I think pretty much still concerned about the level of inventory. I think Lulu's inventory was up like 85% year over year. Now, they were careful to say that they were very short on inventory a year ago because of supply chain issues. So it's not a great
year over year stuff.
Yeah, it's not a perfect comparison. But from the earnings and frankly, the conversation we had at Tractor Supply, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that generally speaking, a deceleration in consumer spending. Inflation's probably going to start to improve a little bit, but will be with us for a while. And overall, most retailers just have a lot of inventory to move through, and that's going to be put a lot of pressure on margins for probably at least the next 2 quarters.
Bed Bath & Beyond dominated the news for a whole bunch of reasons, and they came out with some store closures and a turnaround plan. I guess my question to you is, how many times can you do a turnaround plan? Like this is like they're almost 360 degrees. This is the 3rd, 4th turnaround plan. What were you thinking about the latest in Bed Bath & Beyond?
Well, I think it's just sad, honestly. I think it's very unlikely to work. I've had a couple of conversations with reporters and actually some folks when I was at the Tractor Supply event. And maybe this is a whole separate episode, but I think that, for a long time, the so-called category killers, that was one of the most powerful models in retail. The mid 80s and 90s, you had all sorts of category killers. And they were really the first kind of new innovation that put a ton of pressure on a lot of traditional retailers. But this idea of having a lot of stuff pretty much for everybody in a big store with lots of locations, that's a business model that's, been failing, frankly, for 10 or 15 years. If you go back, we've seen a lot of the category killers, the Circuit Cities, Good Guys, Fry's, and consumer electronics, Linens and Things, one of Bed Bath & Beyond's competitors, a lot of consolidation in office supplies. And most of the kind of category killers that are still reasonably successful either have the advantage of a really different kind of customer base, like Home Depot and Lowe's, which, most of what they sell really requires a large physical store. They have a contractor business, or some of the pet guys or Best Buy, which have really evolved more into services and just focusing more. So I think in the age of so much physical competition in a lot of more specialized categories, and the internet being pretty good at selling commodity products, it's really hard to imagine what a Toys R Us could have done and what a Bed Bath & Beyond can do. And as I've said many times, I say in my book, you're not very likely to cost cut and store close your way to prosperity when your business model is fundamentally broken and your issue is relevance and differentiation. So I heard some smart moves, arguably, to conserve cash and get their balance sheet in better shape. Heard some smart moves in terms of more focus in their merchandising strategy and kind of going back to basics. But when the dust settles on that, what is the powerful reason for a lot of shoppers to go shop at Bed Bath & Beyond? Haven't seen that yet, and they don't have much time to get it right.
Let's take a trip now. Let's journey to the Wobbly Unicorn part of our podcast.
This is the far side of the zoo.
So let's start out with Klarna and Affirm. Who was it? I think it was you said, buy now, pay never. So what's going on with
well, it turns out there's some people that are buying now and not paying, and having spent some time in the credit business, that's not a good outcome. Yeah, we heard from Klarna and Affirm, really this consistent pattern. I don't want to beat a dead horse or kick a wobbly unicorn when it's possibly going to go down. But yeah, sales continue to grow. Profits continue to get worse. Many of these companies, I think some questions about how much money they need to raise to keep things going. So watch that. My other favorite story of the Wobbly Unicorn universe was, and I think we talked on this because I think their earnings, or talked about this on an earlier episode, because I think their earnings had just come out. But TheRealReal, which is in the high-end resale business, they reported again, sales not, I think, going up pretty nicely, but profits going down. And then the CFO, who I guess is relatively new, made a really strong statement, which is in order for their profits to improve, they're going to have to get their sales up and their expenses down. And
wait, say that again. Wait, what kind of math?
No, I should try. Let me say that more slowly. So people, and my favorite, I
Let me get a pen note. I got to get a pen. Sorry, wait. Okay, go ahead.
Well, my favorite comment from somebody was, and some people may have heard this before, where sportscaster John Madden famously said, "If we score more points than the other guy, then we're going to win the game." Thank you.
Thank you,
Einstein.
Thank you. Well, when you're new in the job, you got to put to put a stake in the ground. You got that's a signal to the employees for something. So now the other interesting news that was kind of dominating that part of the news is Peloton, who has been gyrating and moving about. What they made an interesting move with Amazon.
Yeah, well, they I know we talked about on one of the episodes, they announced cost cutting and store closing and so forth, but they're another one of these DTC type of brands that are taking the D out of DTC, as our friend Simeon likes to say, and they are going to sell a selection of their products on Amazon. Some folks think this is brilliant. Others think this is a sign of desperation. I think they're at a point where they need to expand their reach and their distribution pretty quickly because the situation's quite dire there. So I'd probably be more in the desperation camp. If you really want a Peloton, you probably can find it without having to go to Amazon. So it's not obvious that this is all that additive. It certainly runs the risk of being dilutive in some ways, but I think they've kind of backed themselves into a corner. So it might be a good short-term strategy to move some inventory. I'm not sure that this is where they're likely going to end up longer term, but who knows where they're going to end up longer term. It's a pretty messed up business, unfortunately, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny because it would make me think of Amazon as now their role as the retailer of last resort. Some news from our friends at The Gap and their wonky relationship with easy, and he's singing a little Fleetwood Mac. Ironically, tell me about that.
Yeah, he's going to go his own way. Apparently, yeah, he's had this partnership, which we talked about how some of the presentation was pretty widely mocked on social media.
Yeah.
Apparently, he's not too happy with how things are going at the Gap, and is talking about opening his own stores. So that could be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why he'd open a store. He'd just have to open up a ginormous container and just throw all his stuff in, and then people can just walk through the container and maybe take that concept to where it belongs to be.
Well, these are the bold visual merchandising ideas that so many people turn to on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Next, he'll be on Amazon. Now, let's get to the first part of our interview with Steven Pressfield. But first, a word from our presenting sponsor. Marketdial is an easy-to-use testing platform and emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Marketdial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with Marketdial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketdial.com. That's marketdial.com.
Well, Michael and I are so excited to welcome Steven Pressfield to the podcast. Steve, how are you?
I'm great, Steve. Thanks for having me here. It's great to get together with you after both of us being friends of Seth Godin for years and years and finally connecting in person almost.
Well, as we were talking off mic, I'm pretty sure it was Seth who introduced me to your work, I think way back when The War of Art came out. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And I also shared that Seth, at one point when I was early, I believe, in my blog writing career, told me that I wasn't enough of a professional. And I was very offended by that. I considered myself a professional in many respects. And when I was obviously had my feelings hurt, he said, no, I mean being a pro like Steven Pressfield talks about. And so maybe we'll get into that as well, what we mean by turning pro, whether that's in part one or part two. But in any event, welcome. And before we jump in, you've done so many things in your professional and personal career. Maybe you could just give us a minute or two on who you are, what you've been up to, and how you got to be both this incredible fiction and nonfiction writer.
The nutshell version of my career is that it took me, I think, like 27 years from the time I first left a job to try to write until I actually had something published. And I worked a lot of jobs in between that. So I was one of those guys that was an overnight success, 30 years after he started. I've just done a lot of jobs, and it was my dream always to be a writer. And I never had a kind of a plan B, just kind of had to keep plugging and finally got to the point where, things finally started to work for me.
And what was it about writing that was the attraction for you?
I don't even know, Steve. It's like the way it started for me was my first job was in advertising in New York. I worked for Benton & Bowles in New York, and I had a boss named Ed Hannibal who wrote a novel, and it was an overnight success. And he became like a star instantly, and he quit. So I thought to myself, I was like 22 years old. I thought, well, hell, why don't I do that too? And of course, I had no business doing that at all, in the sense of I had no clue what, the writing profession was about. And my life sort of spiraled out of control after that. And I guess I just felt like the only way I can get back out of this is to sort of write my way out of it. That's how it happened. It wasn't like I ever dreamed about it as a kid. I wasn't one of those guys that wrote short stories or anything like that. I just sort of fell off a cliff and spent, 20 years trying to get back up.
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the podcast, because maybe it seems a little bit weird or out of left field to have someone like you on a retail strategy podcast, is really this idea that we come back to a lot of needing to innovate, to fight through all the reasons that something might not work, to actually try stuff. And I think that's what in the beginning really resonated with me about your first nonfiction book, I guess, The War of Art, which was 20 years ago now?
20 years ago.
Something like that. And in it, you talk about this concept of resistance. Can you just tell us, number one, what first led you to write The War of Art and get away from, because at that point, had Legend of Bagger Vance already come out? I can't remember the timeline. So you were having some real success as a novelist and a screenwriter, and then you take this little diversion, which has turned out, I guess, to be a pretty big side gig for you, of writing this book, The War of Art, and talking about resistance. How did you get started on that path, and how did this whole idea of resistance be?
That's a great question. I mean, if you're a writer, I'll just stick in that, in that metaphor here, and you sit down every day in front of the blank page, you become aware instantly that there is this negative force working against you constantly, that it's not a level playing field when you sit down at that blank page. Stuff is fighting you that you have to overcome. In my writing career, simply learning how to deal with that, what I call resistance with a capital R, that took me probably 7 or 8 years. And just to get to the point where I could actually sit down and do the work, whether it was any good or not, that was a whole other story. After, writing a bunch of other stuff, here's kind of how it happened. When you're a working writer, friends come to you and they say, "Oh, I've got a book in me. I want to tell my grandmother's life story, or I've got some whatever." And so I wound up, staying up till 2 a.m. with various friends, trying to psych them up so that they could actually do what they were going to do. Because I could see that they were in the throes of their own resistance, right? They were coming up with a million excuses why they couldn't do it. They were procrastinating. They were full of self-doubt, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would stay up with them till 2 a.m, just trying to kind of psych them up and telling them about this force called resistance that they might not think is real, but is absolutely real. And the first thing you got to learn how to do is to get past that. And of course, nobody ever listened to me. Nobody ever did the book. They all totally blew it off. But at one point, I sort of said, I'm tired of doing this till 2 a.m. So I had about a 2-month period that it was free. And so I wrote it. I wrote the book. And I said, from now on, if anybody asks me that question, I'll just say, here, read this. When The War of Art first came out, I thought in my mind that it was only for writers. I thought only writers really deal with that stuff. And to my amazement, all sorts of creative people, and particularly entrepreneurs, were also dealing with this same force, because people would write me and say, "Oh, thank God, you've given a name to this force that's been kicking my butt for years." So that's sort of how that came about, Steve. And it just, then I've written other kind of follow-ups to it over the years.
You know what I love about, and Stephen, I read your book, Poolside. It was, as I said in the opening of the podcast, that it was Steve Dennis that introduced me to your work. And it really resonated with me. And I want to pull on that thread for a little bit, because initially at one level, it's about writing and being creative. But, one of the central threads of the podcast is, and Steve's work and our thinking is this idea of creativity and fighting against, why does it take crisis to change kind of thinking? And talk a little bit more, let's dig into a little bit more that idea that, this isn't a book or a concept. Resistance is not just for creative types, but it's for, again, as you said, entrepreneurs, corporate executives. How do you step back and say, okay, how do you coach people with that? Take us down a little bit deeper into the idea of resistance and overcoming resistance. The way you start and almost scratch the surface, but in other ways get really into it in The War of Art.
That's a great question. I mean, I do think that it does take a crisis a lot of times. And the reason is that resistance is, first of all, it's so strong. And secondly, it's so nuanced and so devious. I mean, I believe that it's a force that it has an active intelligence. It's not just some blunt instrument that bludgeons you. It's like the devil, it's in your mind. And, for instance, let me just give you sort of what the voice of resistance is, a voice that you hear in your head. And here's what it says to you. It says something like, this new idea that you have, this is a really stupid idea. It's been done a million times, and it's been done a million times better than the way you're going to do it. And by the way, who do you think you are to have this new idea? I mean, you are.
It sounds like imposter. Like I hear that articulated as what do they call it? Imposter complex as well, right? It's
that's
like
a big
you
part
couldn't
of
be
it.
good enough.
Imposter sort of internal
Syndrome,
monologue that you get. Who do you think you are to do this? You're too old, too young, too educated. You're not educated enough. That sort of thing. That's one aspect of resistance that is in your head. And that's why I do think it takes a crisis a lot of times, because that voice defeats us. If you're an entrepreneur that has a new idea, you want to expand your business or whatever it is, that voice will go into your head and say, this is a really dumb idea. Joe Blow tried this down the street. He went out of business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then the other half of resistance is self-doubt, self-sabotage, a tendency to procrastinate, a susceptibility to distraction. You'll get go down a rabbit hole on the internet or whatever it is, or the voice in your head will say, it's a great idea that you have, but let's not do it today. Today is a day where we really have to deal with this warehouse issue or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So resistance will come up with a million reasons, and a lot of them are really plausible reasons why you shouldn't do it today or why you shouldn't do it at all. And so usually, in my experience, it's a little bit of like quitting drinking. You almost have to hit some kind of a crisis moment where you sort of snap out of denial and you say, you know what? I have been avoiding this damn thing. I've been wanting to do this dream of mine for years, and I keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and look where it's got me. Now I'm all screwed up, And then when that sort of crisis hits, like drinking, like realizing, I have a problem here. I got to stop.
So you wouldn't advocate creating a crisis, because I think some people.
No, I wouldn't.
It's
Plus,
like,
I don't think you can really create a real crisis. The crisis is going to create itself.
You can create a crisis a deadline, right? Nothing, the old saying, nothing motivates like a deadline. I've worked with people who say, I wait to the last minute because that's when I get creative, because by God, I've got to get it done by midnight or something like that. I mean, that feels like an artificial construct reading through your work, yeah?
Yes, but I suppose it would work. I've had deadlines, motivate me.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, and maybe this is what resonates with me from a lot of your work, not just the War of Art, is almost seeing resistance as this character, this dragon you have to slay that is there. When I go to sit down and write, almost picturing that there is this force that I have to battle with in some way, shape, or form. Like that's just in it. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to me, I think that's one of the things that really connects. It's sort of this hero's journey that I've got to overcome. This, it's Darth Vader or whatever.
People have written to me. People have written to me with lots of different ways. That they visualize this force. And whatever works, I do think of it myself as like a dragon that you have to slay every morning.
Because it's always there. I think big. I think anybody who's really doing creative work, talking about creative work very broadly, anybody who is any kind of artist. And I think in the business world, if you're an entrepreneur or somebody trying to do innovation at a big company, you're a form of doing artistic work. Any sort of creative work, I think, has that dynamic that you have to fight again, which is why I think we wanted to have you on, because I think that's something that's really pretty much a universal experience for anybody who's really trying to change the status quo or bring something new.
Yeah, the thing about this, Steve, is that nobody teaches you this in school. They don't tell you there is this force. They say, oh, you want to write a novel or you want to start a business? Well, just sit down and do it. But nobody tells you that the playing field is not level, and that there are a lot of enemy cannons aiming right at you.
Do you think because we teach, like if you go to school for certain things, you learn technique, you learn process? I just know what the kinds of things that I was taught, and I agree with you. You're not really taught maybe it's different in acting school or something, but having studied economics, having gone to business school, having worked at big companies, there's a lot of technique that's very particular to the kind of business we're in or how one does marketing or whatever, but not this, these tools and techniques, or even just kind of reframing your thinking that you get into in your work about how to overcome doubt, how to push against that force.
Yeah. I mean, nobody teaches you, there's no class in cold calling, They don't tell you that, until you get out on your first day on a job, and then you realize, oh my God, I'm completely unprepared for this, mentally and psychologically.
So are there any just, I hate to, boil this down to like top 10 tips or anything like that. People should read your work. Absolutely. But also there's lots out there. I know you've got your own blog, you've got videos. There's a great episode that you did with Oprah Winfrey. I mean, there's lots of ways to go much deeper into your work. But if you just had to say, somebody listens to this podcast and they're staring at that blank page, or they've got a meeting with their team about some new idea, are there 2 or 3 things you might say could prove helpful for them to kind of push through their fear and actually sit down and do the work they need to do?
Well, the number one thing I think is just simply being aware that there is such a thing as resistance with a capital R, that when you do sit down to come up with something innovative, whatever it is, that there is going to be this force. And the other thing that what I'm about to say, I think is a kind of a key point. One of the laws of resistance is that the more a project, let's say let's stay in the writing genre, a new book, the more important that is to the evolution of your soul, right, in a positive way, the more resistance you will feel to it. If it's just some little idea you'll just have a little bit of resistance. If it's something really big, you'll have massive resistance to it. You'll be sabotaging yourself like mad. So, in a way, that is a really good sign. And I tell myself that all the time. When I'm experiencing massive resistance to something, I say to myself, that means that whatever this idea is that I'm being blocked on, that's a really good idea, and I better do it. So that's a really good point. When you feel a lot of resistance, that's a good sign. It shows that, it's like the bad guys are marshaling all their energy to stop you because they know your idea is a real good one.
I think that's a little bit like, I don't know if you follow Pema Chodron's work at all, where fear,
I don't, but
fear is
I'm
the
aware.
natural reaction to moving closer to the truth. I think it's kind of a similar sort of notion.
Exactly.
Now, unpack that for me a little bit, because how do you understand the difference between you don't phrase it this way, but positive versus negative? I mean, if you're experiencing the kind of resistance as you described for any idea, maybe it's genuinely a bad idea. Maybe the Gap shouldn't put a bunch of clothes into a big pile at the front of the store, but they overcame whatever they were thinking. Is there a way in your tradecraft or your philosophy or your teaching to kind of discern the difference between these two things?
That's a great question, Michael, because it really is. Resistance is so diabolical that it will glom onto something that's to stop you that does make sense. It's not just totally imaginary. So, but my own version, myself, what I say to myself, my own little mantra is if I'm asking, is this resistance or is it valid? This thought that's in my head, this negative thought, my mantra for that is when in doubt, it's resistance. Because I have found more times than not, which is not to say that, there aren't bad ideas, but more times than not, in my experience, it's a great idea and you're just experiencing this fear and this self-doubt and this self-sabotage. At least as a writer, if I have an idea and I start into working on a book, I will be racked by self-doubt for months. It isn't like as soon as you start, the clouds part and the sun comes through. Resistance will try to keep sabotaging you day 1, day 2, day 20, day 40, day 50. It'll keep telling you, this is really a shitty idea. I'm sorry you went so far into it, that kind of thing. So, like I say, when in doubt, at least in my opinion, it's resistance.
Let me ask you the question, the inverse. So, sometimes you read stories about initiatives or books that almost write themselves. I wrote that, you hear that sometimes about artists. I wrote the whole album, and is the lack of resistance almost an indication that it's not the best idea? Like, this is what I'm struggling with, to try to understand those two. Because
that's a great
some things
question.
go really well.
I really don't have an answer to that, Michael, because I've had those things too, where a book just came out of me in a flash with no resistance, and a lot of times it's been really good. I guess I can't say that every time resistance is going to hit you. But those things where you have a tailwind all the way and things seem to be flowing do seem to be the exception, but they are for real. And in fact, I would say when I wrote The War of Art, it came out very fast. There was some resistance, but not very much. And I really don't have an explanation for that. According to the law of resistance, you should be feeling a lot, but sometimes you don't. It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for it.
Well, listen, this has been a great discussion. Now, this is the first part of a two-part discussion. We have lots more to talk about. You've got such a wealth of information. How do I describe you? I mean, in the beginning, we, teacher, philosopher, writer, screenwriter. Like, how do you describe you? How do you think of yourself at this point? Just as we sign off on this first part. What's the best way to capture you?
I have no idea. I'm a believer in the muse, in the goddess. And if I would describe my occupation, I would say I'm a servant of the muse. So whatever the next idea is that she puts before me, I do it. And sometimes it's on left field and sometimes it's in right field.
Well, I guess that's the fun of this podcast art, is folks can make up their own minds. But let's leave it there, and we'll pick it up for our second part of our discussion. Stephen Pressfield, thanks again for joining us. And the book is, well, there's many books, many screenplays, but the particular book that I think anybody listening to this should have on their shelf or pick up, I did, The War of Art. Break through the blocks and win your inner creative battles. All right, Stephen, thanks a lot, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, like our discussion with Seth Godin on what retailers can actually do to fight climate change. New episodes of Season 5, presented by markdowns, will show up each and every week. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one, plus the host of the popular YouTube cooking show Last Request Barbecue. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn or meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.